Episode 6 of Alien Earth begins with us back in the present on Prodigy Island, with Wendy fascinated by the rapidly growing xenomorph. Kirsch is quick to reassure Joe that Wendy single-handedly took out an adult xeno with just a little knife, so she can pretty much handle herself. Kirsch is not too worried by what's happening right now, reminding Joe that Wendy is the future and she has a bright one ahead of her. He also belittles Joe's idea of taking her home so they can live like a family. Meanwhile, Dame Sylvia, Arthur and Atomind look over Nibs. The latter is not happy about Nibs' sudden outburst that she's pregnant and wants it fixed. Dame Sylvia is quick to remind him that she has trauma from her moments at the crash site, hence her outburst and erratic mood. Instead of the initial suggestion of therapy though, Atomind decides a full memory wipe is the best way to go. Arthur and Dame disagree here, but because of this, Arthur is fired for disobeying a direct order. As for Nibs, the memory wipe is successful. Joe speaks to Wendy in the hallway, expressing concerns about the xenomorph. Wendy though is nonchalant about the whole thing, and she's convinced that this xeno is actually one of the good ones. Wendy wants to continue her experiments with it, and tells Joe that she doesn't want to leave with him. Boy Cavalier shows up to see the CEO of Yutani next, with Barrister McAfee working as a moderator overseeing proceedings. He's been hired on behalf of the Five to try and facilitate this meeting and come to an agreement over what to do with this crashed ship, and the specimens on board of course. Cavalier peddles the story of a cover-up and then mentions the specimens themselves, forcing the CEO of Yutani to cave. She admits that the species on board were meant to be studied at an off-planet research facility, which is where they'll be transferred to once she gets them back. There's a bit of back and forth between them until they eventually agree to a $20 billion settlement, but Boy Cavalier has a trick up his sleeve. He mentions how there's currently a quarantine procedure in place and will be for another 6 weeks. Miss Yutani is seething, and when the meeting is over, decides Morrow should press on with his plan. Now Morrow intends to destabilize the facility and cause outright chaos. He'll then swoop in and exfil the xeno and the specimens. Interestingly, Kirsch and Morrow wind up verbally skirmishing in the elevator afterwards, with Morrow promising to see the old toy soon. Back on the island, Slightly is jittery and worried about his saboteur plans and shows up to see Joe. Interestingly, this guy is actually sketching out an escape route, but that's easier said than done on an island surrounded by a mass of water. Now Slightly wants to take Joe into the lab, but his desperation comes off as a little too awkward and unnerving, so Joe goes on patrol with his buddies instead. He wanders through the thick trees, keeping a lookout as Joe talks about leaving once again. And no, he's not particularly subtle about it, as they flag up his concerns and tell him that they've got a good thing going on here. Back in the lab, Wendy appears to be understanding the alien language and starts to communicate, or at least mimic, the xenomorph sounds. As a rapidly evolving alien watches on. Now Ocelos also watches all of this unfold from its cage too, paying specific attention to Tootles when he enters the lab alone to feed them all. Naturally, Tootles is an absolute idiot here, and along with breaking the feeding compartment door, he's super jumpy when Ocelos bangs on the glass and gets himself locked in with one of the specimens. Now these happen to be large bugs that spray corrosive acid and eat metal. It burns the synth and eventually kills it, feeding off the robotic parts. Realising that Nibs has had her memory wiped, Wendy shows up to question Dame Sylvia. She stands by the memory wipe and points out that Nibs had corrupt data. Now Wendy questions the lab and facility, believing humanity is what's really wrong here rather than the aliens themselves. Now while packing up his gear, Joe shows up to see Arthur at the lab. He's surprised to see the guy has been fired, given he cares about his work. And Joe speaks plainly and asks if he's safe around murderous specimens that want to kill, reproduce and destroy everything.
Are you stupid or something?
Arthur plays a part, reassuring the guy while actually typing on his computer that he needs to take Wendy and get the hell out of there. He even drops off a boat code for good measure too, and removes the trackers on the simps. When Joe leaves, an error suddenly pops up on screen, confirming that Tootles' signal has been lost. Now Kirsch watches Slightly as he heads into the lab with Arthur, and there they find him absolutely destroyed. He doesn't wear any protective gear or try to call for help though, and instead he unlocks the door himself to bring the simp out, leaving the door wide open in the process. This gives Slightly enough time to open the other lab doors and locking him in, leaving Arthur inside all alone with the creatures. The facehugger does its work, with Kirsch watching on from his tablet on the plane. Now interestingly, Kirsch doesn't actually tell Boy Cavalier what's happening, deciding to keep quiet instead. Slightly attempts to hide in a human-sized vent with Arthur, but it doesn't do much good. We cut once more to Ocelos, which brings this episode to an ominous conclusion. So Alien Earth returns this week, and without the iconic callbacks and nostalgia bait from the Maginot flashback, the poor writing in this show is presented front and centre. The pacing is slow and ponderous, which gives a lot of time to chew over the various machinations and problems, of which there are many. Now at the start of the show, we were told that these specimens are apex predators, having killed a lot of scientists in an effort to get these things on board. Now, they sent Simps in because they're strong and immune to biological attacks, helping to cage these up and transport them around from the crashed ship. However, 6 episodes in, we're now introduced to a new fly monster that feeds on synthetics and eats metal. It can spew corrosive acid too, which is really lucky for the plot now that we need some of the synthetics to die. The same creatures, I may add, that were transported in metal and glass cages on board a metal ship, and they haven't been seen until now. Along with making everybody incompetent so the story can work, we also get the questionable power levels for the xenomorph that's not really explained. Now early on we've seen it rip through steel doors and pierce metal at will, but yet here it's being kept in a flimsy glass cage and can't seem to escape. That's before mentioning the frightening intelligence this thing has. Now one could argue it's because it's gestated from a lung rather than a full human host and it may not be as strong, but the jury is still out on this one. It was perhaps obvious that Arthur would bite the bullet, but the hilarious way this slots into place with Slightly's plan, right on the cusp of him needing someone to get into the lab, is a little too convenient, especially given this scientist, who literally moments earlier told Joe to get the hell out of here because it's not safe, heads into the lab. The same lab, I may add, that we were told earlier in the series was inaccessible for humans. I guess it's kind of lucky that Arthur now has clearance to get in. But once in there, I can kind of get behind the idea that Arthur cares about these Simps enough that, in a fit of panic, he opened the doors without thinking. But then what's with the vent being in a contained room? Isn't the idea of a containment lab that it's, contained? To try and be fair here, the idea of no alarms going off or people being notified across the island can be explained because Kirsch appears to be overseeing things and orchestrating his own version of chaos, but the writing is hard to look past. And the meeting between Cavalier and Yutani is perhaps the biggest example of this, because while Cavalier clearly has leverage over Yutani, she should have leverage over him too. We know that Morrow has downloaded all the ship files into his head, which one would assume would also include footage from the sabotage with Petrovich. So why did Yutani not use this or at least hint at this in the meeting? Morrow has shown massive loyalty to Yutani so far, and it seems odd that he wouldn't mention this, especially when she folds and admits to having specimens brought to Earth. I could go on with this, but ultimately Alien Earth has been a massive disappointment and the poor writing is doing absolutely nothing to help matters. But what about you guys? Do you agree, or do you think we're nitpicking a little bit too much with this episode? As always, do let us know in the comments below. Thanks for watching. Smash a like or subscribe to the channel, your support is very much appreciated. I'm Greg Wheeler, and from all of us over here at The Review Geek, we'll see you on the next video.